tied him up and dragged him barefoot onto the wet slabs of the monastery courtyard. He was no longer screaming. A children's choir was singing. Someone in the crowd wiped his forehead and whispered, "Even now, he stinks of mint and iron." He didn't resist when they tore off his cassock. He did not utter a word when his skin touched the cold iron rings embedded in the old stone. He did not pray. He only breathed deeply and heavily, like sick cattle before slaughter. The monks stood at a distance. The candles flickered, and the boys in the choir sang as if they had rehearsed it hundreds of times. Their faces were washed, their hair neatly trimmed, and their voices were clear as a spring well. Against this backdrop, the dirty body lying on the ground looked particularly alien. Naked, thin, covered in spots. His legs were covered in sores. There were burn marks on his back. His chest was scratched with fingernails, as if he had tried to tear his soul out of his body. Nothing happened by accident within the walls of St. Catherine's Abbey, especially executions, especially ones like this. No one spoke his name aloud. He was called the brewmaster, the monk with mint blood, or simply he. They said he confessed more death row inmates than the abbot, that he brewed potions that killed women without a trace, that he brought wax-sealed oaths to the crypts where bishops died, that he knew where the keys to the side gates of the cathedral were kept, that he could make food smell like incense, even if it was rotten, that he once came back from the dead. The investigation lasted 4 months, yet the abbot delayed reporting him until the very last moment. But after Bishop Schwarzenfeld's death, when his body had already swollen on the 3rd day, and a liquid with the smell of vinegar and rot flowed from his ears, the papal investigator arrived immediately. The Chronicles said, it was decided to question the servants. The medical board confirmed that death was not caused by old age, but by poison entering the blood through the breath. The heart stopped suddenly, without a spasm. The pupils were dilated. He died, sitting on pillows, motionless. Inside the monastery, everything changed overnight. The kitchens were closed. Fasting was declared. Personal amulets, dried herbs, ointments, and bags of salt were confiscated. Sick monks were temporarily transferred to a separate tower. One of the brothers hanged himself in the bell tower, allegedly out of fear of being interrogated. He himself did not hide. He did not run away. He did not deny anything. When he was first taken to the basement for interrogation, he sat down on a stone and began to wipe his hands on his knees, methodically, for a long time, as if cleaning something greasy. The investigator later wrote in his report, he did not resist. He spoke calmly. His eyes were cloudy. His body smelled spicy, like a drying room. There were traces of herbs on his fingernails. His palms had thin cuts, like those of a carver or scraper. His voice was even, his speech clear, without mistakes. He said, I did what I was asked to do, nothing more. The execution was ordered without trial. The papal bull stated, let his body be divided by suffering, so that his spirit may depart without rest. This meant that his death was to be public, painful, and without absolution. He was not given a funeral service. He was not given communion. He was not dressed in a shroud. All this was considered unacceptable for a poisoner, especially a monk. Rumors about his crimes multiplied. Some claimed that he had killed the elders on the orders of the cardinal to free up space. Some said that he was avenging his brothers who had died of the plague. Some even recalled how a vessel of blood and a note were found in one of the cells, on which was written, their bodies are a sacrifice, their souls are a debt. None of these versions was confirmed, but neither were they refuted. The servants who cared for him in his final weeks later testified, he didn't eat, he only drank water with vinegar. He sat rocking back and forth at night. He prayed silently, but it sounded like he was arguing with someone. No one looked at his face. He smelled like an old grave, sweet and heavy. His clothes were not changed. He would not allow it. We had difficulty removing the bandages, Everything had grown into the ulcers. Doctors called from Prague refused to touch the body. They only confirmed gangrene on the left leg, bed sores on the back, ulcers on the buttocks, festering wounds in the groin, dried gums, a foul odor from the mouth, and blisters filled with fluid under the skin. One of the doctors wrote, "There are traces of mercury on the skin, possibly rubbed in repeatedly. The pupils are uneven, the pulse is weak, the fingers are crooked. The man was probably preparing for death and trying to prolong his suffering." But what was done to him in his last days was not treatment. It was deliberate starvation. He was given only bread, left in the cold, and not allowed to wash. Once he vomited blood. No one came to him. The political situation in the monastery was tense. After the bishop's death, a struggle for influence began. Young monks tried to push their mentor forward. The elders complained that power was crumbling. A man was sent from Rome to keep order, a stern, silent archdeacon who never took off his gloves. Meanwhile, a platform was erected in the courtyard, not for burning, but for public humiliation. He was tied up with his back to the ground. First, they poured water over him. Then they placed hot stones on his feet. When his skin began to crack, they began to scrape it off with iron scrapers. All this took place to the singing of a choir made up of the abbey's younger pupils. Their voices, clear, ringing, almost heavenly, drowned out the moans. This was intentional. The choir was like the funeral service he had been denied. The singing was like a mockery. The body was treated slowly so that the pain would not be lost. Witnesses later wrote, "He hardly screamed. He just breathed quickly. He screamed once when the skin was removed from his shoulder. Then the choir stopped. One boy began to cry, but the abbot ordered them to continue. 3 hours later, he lost consciousness. But he did not die. They poured cold water over him and picked at his wounds. 6 hours later, it was over. He died without confession. His body was left in the cold for a day. Then they lowered him into a pit behind the monastery. He was not buried. No cross was placed on his grave. They just threw lime on top of him. His bones were found 12 years later when they began to build a new extension. Part of his skull was broken, his spine was twisted, and there were knife marks on his bones. After that, documents began to disappear. Records of interrogations disappeared. Lists of those who died from potions disappeared. The cardinal's letters disappeared. All that remained were rumors and a single entry in a private diary. "We did not kill a man, but a reflection of our fear. Everything else will remain with us." When his body, still warm but already drained of blood, was lowered into a pit behind the northern wall of the abbey, the ground was not consecrated. None of the priests wanted to read the funeral rites. Only one blind monk whispered a prayer, stumbling over the words. No one answered, "Amen." An hour later, the pit was filled with lime and covered with 2 flat stones. One was to keep the dogs from digging it up. The other was to keep people from remembering. However, it was impossible to forget. The death of the poisoner brother only opened the door behind which rot had been gathering. Rumors began to spread in the monastery, at first muffled, then louder and louder. Servants said that at night they could hear breathing in the cellars, as if someone were coughing in the corner. The students claimed that the cells smelled of blood and mint, although no one had brought in any fresh herbs. One of the younger novices began to pray hysterically, claiming that he had seen skin crawling up the wall, with spots like those on the back of an executed man. A week later, the choir collapsed. During the service, 4 boys began to suffocate, and one died at the altar. This was called punishment for participating in abomination. The abbot convened an emergency council. He wanted to cleanse the monastery, spiritually and physically. It was decided to carry out an exorcism. The priests walked around the walls 3 times with incense and holy water. But the smell of death did not go away. Closer to winter, the monks began to fall ill. The first signs were fever, then diarrhea, sores on the lips, and bloating. Doctors spoke of wet exhaustion. Later, it turned out the 3 of those who fell ill were those who had helped prepare the execution. One of them lost the skin on his left hand. Another's teeth began to rot despite his age. The third was found hanged by his cassock belt in a storeroom where medicinal infusions had previously been kept. The archdeacon, who remained in the monastery after the execution, ordered all the instruments that had touched the bodies to be burned, but it was too late. The rot that had started in the flesh spread to the heads. Excerpts from reports have been preserved in the documents. The abbot does not leave his chambers. He complains of noises and shadows. He ordered the windows to be boarded up. He has stopped eating. He says that it has returned. A rumor spread among the novices that the poisoner had given one of the children a drop of his blood to drink before he died. Now that child can see through walls. The boy was taken away, but he died on the way. Words that people had previously tried not to utter were heard more and more often in conversation. Curse, desecration, retribution. One of the oldest monks, a former librarian, wrote a note. He was not the first. In the last century, they burned the man who cured the plague here. Then everyone died. The place was forgotten for 40 years. Then it was illuminated again. Everything is repeating itself. He was found 2 days later. His face was burned and his eyes gouged out. An alarming letter was sent to Rome. The Pope replied briefly, "Restore order, remove all traces, appoint a new abbot, remove all junior students. No need to keep a chronicle." It was this last sentence that caused confusion. Until then, everything that happened had been recorded in chronicles, reports, personal diaries. Now it was the opposite. For the first time in many years, the order was not to write. Meanwhile, the body of the executed man began to cause concern. Officially, it no longer existed, but one of the new brothers, who had arrived from Münster, claimed to have seen a closed coffin being carried into the monastery basement. Another said he heard knocking coming from the cemetery on the night after the execution. A third claimed to have seen a monk in a cassock standing at the south gate, even though all the doors were closed. In December, real panic broke out. 3 novices disappeared. They were found only 6 days later, in an abandoned storage room under the refectory. All 3 were naked, their bodies covered with sores, the skin on their shoulders peeled off like boiled chicken. None of them had wounds incompatible with life. A doctor from Trier, called in to examine them, wrote, "Death was caused by exhaustion." But all 3 were lying as if in prayer. One had nail marks on his chest, the second had fingerprints on his neck, the third had a palm print on his skin. As if it had been burned, it was unnaturally large. It did not belong to them. After that, the archdeacon ordered that access to the dungeons be closed. All the students were to be taken away. The records were to be destroyed. Several pages were torn from the main chronicle. Some of the copyists later tried to restore them, but only a few fragments have survived. In the cold, where the skin was cracking, he spoke to them, not with his voice, but with his breath. They repeated. He asked them not to call his name, only to cook, only to give, only to listen. Later, these lines were attributed to a madman, but the fear remained. A new abbot arrived in February. With him were 8 guards. The monastery had never been guarded before. The new rules said, don't mention the execution, don't keep old herbs, don't cook anything without signing it, don't hear confessions without 2 witnesses. But none of this stopped the decline. The monastery started to empty out. The old folks died. Young people didn't come. The land was transferred to the archdiocese. With each passing month, the abbey lost its meaning, like a body without organs. The power that had previously been based on fear now crumbled under the weight of memories. But the most terrible moment came in the spring, when a group of workers digging a well stumbled upon an empty pit. The stones placed over the poisoner's body had been moved. The lime was incomplete. At the bottom was only a black mark. No bones. The servant who guarded the cemetery disappeared that same night. He was never found, only his shoes, and a piece of skin with a fingernail embedded in it. In April of the following year, the abbey was completely deserted. By order of the archdiocese, the remaining monks were transferred to neighboring monasteries. The property was inventoried, and some of it was sold, while the rest was confiscated. The doors were boarded up. The locks were sealed with wax-bearing crosses. Only 3 servants remained on site to look after the grounds, keep an eye on the buildings, and feed the dogs. One of them, an old mute named Agon, later became the sole witness to the strange events that took place after the complex was closed. According to a report by the quartermaster Wilhelm von Nassenberg, sent to the Archbishop's office in June, an act of breaking into the premises was recorded. Due to a foul odor coming from the outer wall, it was decided to inspect the north wing. Accompanied by soldiers, he entered a long corridor where the cells for new novices had previously been located. There, according to him, the walls were covered with mold. The air was thick as oil, but not putrid, sweet like rotten honey, unpleasantly cloying. In a back room, they found a carved wooden chest that had previously belonged to the apothecary. Inside were dried herbs, the remains of some thick resin, and 3 figures carved from finger bones. The same quartermaster wrote, "There were fresh footprints on the floor, but there was more than 1/4 of an inch of dust. Not a single window was broken. The doors were locked. How he got in there is unclear. How and who, unknown." Rumors that the body of the poisoner's brother had not been found reached Rome only in the middle of the year. The response was again brief. "Do not exaggerate. Transfer the land to the temple. Do not mention it." However, as it turned out, the land could not be cleansed. Attempts to illuminate the site where the pit had been were unsuccessful. The priest appointed to perform the ritual died on the way from a brain hemorrhage. His body, as the report stated, was still hot half a day after his death. The servant who held the censer went mad. He was found on the 6th day by the river, trying to rub ashes into his chest, whispering, "Inside is mint. Inside is a diaper. I drank," he breathed. Documents about these events were later destroyed, but one duplicate survived, passed on to the private collection of Dr. Ambrose Rothstein. In his letter to a colleague in Osnabrück, he wrote, "Among all the plague and putrefaction, this one is special. A body that disappeared from lime, walls weeping with a pungent sweat, people going mad from the smell. All this is not a disease, it is internal decay in stone. It is as if the dwelling itself has died and is now rotting alive." Rothstein, contrary to the ban, arrived in the area in October. He lived there for 3 days. On the 4th day, he disappeared. He was found in the dining room in a chair, wrapped in a rope, with his knees pressed against his chin. His eyes were bulging, his fingernails torn off. Written in ash on the floor were the words, "Now I know what he was feeding them." Later, attempts were made to turn the place into a military warehouse, then into barracks, and finally, it was sold at auction in the hope of erasing all traces. But no organization managed to stay there for more than a year. It always started the same way. Workers developed rashes, there were moans at night, equipment disappeared. It was impossible to maintain the temperature in the room. There were mice that could not be exterminated, and there were marks on the dust. By 1700, the building was already empty. Only a small part of the wall, overgrown with moss, has survived to this day. On it is a stain resembling a crucifix, but without a cross. But the real consequences unfolded not in the monastery itself, but in those who were connected with the execution. The cardinal who approved the punishment died 2 years later of a ruptured intestine. Before his death, he told his servant, "I can hear him boiling." The abbot who signed the order was convicted of heresy after being accused of preaching poisoning as a form of purification. Two senior monks who participated in the interrogations disappeared without a trace. One disappeared on his way to Burgundy, the other in his own cell. All that remained was a note. I wanted to stop, but it was already inside. The chief choir boy, whose voice accompanied the execution, survived. He became a singer in St. Mark's Cathedral, became famous, and lived to a ripe old age, but he spent the last years of his life in complete silence. He gave up music. He did not speak. He kept a diary in which he wrote the same phrase over and over again: "Never sing over a dead body again." In medical treatises of the middle of the century, the term mint body is found. This is what they began to call cases of slow decay with preservation of consciousness. Patients remained sane, but emitted a sweet, herbal smell. Their skin was covered with ulcers, and their internal organs decomposed without causing fever. Almost all such patients went mad and died in agony. One doctor, describing a case from Gdansk, noted, he asked for his skin to be stripped off because something was moving inside him. It was as if the sounds were coming not from his ears, but from his ribs. Later, in the 19th century, a fragment of skin with an etched pattern resembling liturgical text was exhibited in the collection of curiosities at the Vienna Museum of Anatomy. The label claimed that it was a relic from the Abbey of St. Catherine. The exhibit later disappeared and was replaced with a copy. The reason for its removal: inappropriate associations. But one of the curators, who was fired after that, said in a private conversation, "There were words on that skin, but they weren't written, they grew. Every spring, new ones appeared.